I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
I'm Hank Hankins of the Mecklenburg County Bar. I'm here today on behalf of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism to interview Joseph W. Grier Jr., also of the Mecklenburg County Bar. Mr. Grier was recently the recipient of the Chief Justice's Professionalism Award for his distinguished 63 years of the practice of law in North Carolina. How are you, Mr. Grier?
I am in surprisingly good health and hopefully still mentally alert.
Well, we appreciate very much your taking this time to be with us today and to talk about your years in the practice of law.
Somewhere in my junior year at Chapel Hill, up till that time, I had planned to go to Chapel Hill Law School. Why I changed my mind about that, I have no idea, but sometime in my junior year, I decided rather than, and it was reasoned out of the fact that I'd already been in Chapel Hill 3 years and had bad work habits, and I knew that if I was going to do in law school what I anticipated and turned out to be true, I would need to do in terms of study, I better have a change of venue. So somewhere in my junior year, I decided, and I'm not sure how I picked these two, but I decided to apply to Harvard and to Yale, and somewhat to my surprise, because I was not the best academic performer at Chapel Hill in my earlier years, I was accepted in both the schools.
At the time that you went to law school at Harvard, your friend John Parker's father was Chief Judge of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, is that right?
That's right.
So your introduction to the practice of law and the potential of being a lawyer really came through Judge Parker's family and your close friendship with his son John, is that right?
I think that would be true. Other than my grandfather having been sheriff and the connection that had with the courts generally may have had something to do early on, but Judge Parker was such an outstanding person, and even as a young man in that time, I appreciated what an outstanding person he was.
Now, after you graduated from Harvard, tell us about your clerkship with Judge Parker.
Well, when I finished Harvard in 1940, the practice that now prevails of lawyers in Charlotte and firms in Charlotte soliciting people to come practice law with them, clerkships, did not prevail as it came to. When I graduated from law school, I took the bar and was fortunate enough, and I think this ought to go in a memorial, pass it the first time. One of the things I think is true is that the two people in my generation of people who probably succeeded best as judges were Bright Craven and McMillan, and both of them flunked the bar the first time. I was fortunate enough to have passed the bar, and not having anybody offering to give me employment, along with another person who had graduated from Chapel Hill, we rented two offices, very small offices, without any reception room or without any secretary at all, on the fourth floor of the law building, and declared that we were ready to practice law, whoever came. Without any, I had worked a summer while I was at law school, but I had no other support other than that I had now passed the bar and had a certificate to that effect and was prepared to practice law.
Now, how long did that brief period of practice in the law building last there before you joined Judge Parker?
About 6 months.
I see. That would have been in 1940?
Yeah.
Now, the country at that time, I guess, was still struggling out of the decade-long depression, is that right?
Yes.
And were most of the lawyers in Charlotte at that time located in the law building?
At that time, the law building, at that time there were between 80 and 100 lawyers in Charlotte, and all of them were in the law building with the exception of Thigpen, who was a tax attorney who had an office uptown, and two lawyers who were patent attorneys who had offices uptown. But all the other lawyers in the Mecklenburg Bar, somewhere, I guess, 80 to 100, were in the Charlotte Law Building. And it was the very best of circumstances to practice law with all the lawyers right there. You could walk down one flight of stairs or more and go in somebody's office, and because there was no air conditioning, the doors were always unlocked and usually the windows were open, and carry on your business. And what you didn't carry on in that fashion, you went down to the first floor where the soda shop was and had your business down there. And when you had to go to the courthouse, it was right out the side door in the same block as the old Mecklenburg County Courthouse was.
And you knew all of the lawyers, junior and senior, pretty quickly and pretty well in that environment.
You would get to know the other lawyers very well. They would have calendar call over in one of the large courtrooms every Friday morning, at which one of the seniors of the bar, a person from Union County named Plummer Stewart, who had once practiced with Judge Parker before he became a judge, would call the calendar. Plummer Stewart carried the peremptory calendar around on an envelope in his pocket. And if you wanted to get your case set peremptory, you went to Plummer Stewart, and he got out his envelope and looked and would put your case down on it, and that was the order in which the cases were called. There would be, every Friday, though, there would be a calendar call at which lesser cases would be given non-peremptory settings. The practice was more informal then.
In February of 1942, you went on active duty with the United States Army then.
And to be it less ceremoniously, I volunteered to be drafted.
And from being inducted as a private down in Fort Jackson, you went on to OCS and became an officer in the artillery. Did I remember that right?
It was a time when the United States forces, Pearl Harbor had occurred, and the United States forces were being beefed up, enlarged as fast as they possibly could. And every time they would arrange some people to be soldiers in the Army, they had to train officers, so that there was great opportunities to go to OCS, Officers Candidate School, partly on the ground that it was sort of near Charlotte. I was able to arrange to go to the Officers Candidate School down along just north of Wilmington, Camp Davis, and went down there, and I've been in a number of situations where at the time I started doing what I was doing, I felt utterly disqualified. But when I went to that officer's candidate school after having been in the Army for only about 4 months, I guess, and almost all of the other people who had gotten in the officer schools had been non-commissioned officers, and some of them with 2 and 3 and 4 years in Panama and various places. And I thought for sure that the first 2 or 3 weeks I was in officer's candidate school that they were surely going to boot me out for being unqualified. But I didn't. I managed to graduate with the class as a second lieutenant and went down with some other people to Camp Stewart, where they were organizing a new battalion, which was fortunate because pretty soon I had coming in on the early days of the organization of the new battalion that had only the cadre of officers in front of me, maybe 35 officers in the battalion. Pretty soon I was, along with other people who'd gone from OCS at the same time I did, we had seniority on 2/3 of the other officers that was there, which meant that I got to be a first lieutenant a lot quicker than I would ever have thought that I would.
And eventually you went with that unit out to the Southwest Pacific, is that?
Went to the Solomon Islands, to Lagi was the first base, Guadalcanal, and then on up the Solomon Islands to a little place that hardly anybody's ever heard of called Emaru, right on the equator, and from there ultimately to Luzon, Clark Field in the Philippines.
When did you then actually come back to Charlotte to begin your civilian post-war life then?
Having had a clerkship with Judge Parker and having had the experience in the Army, and there were all the people who had been, all the lawyers, and there was a sizable number of them who had been away in World War II, all came back at one time, so that there were an awful lot of, some 30, 40 people who had been in military service. Suddenly in January or February came back and were in Charlotte, and I think that I went down to, I got back in December, and I went by Carol Tolliver and Francis Clarkson's office. They had been practicing together just as two individuals, never thought of employing an associate, had been in practice together for 20 years there in the law building, decided to offer me a place as a clerk. And so I began to work with them in January of, I guess, of 46.
That was on the 4th floor of the law building?
4th floor of the Charlotte Law Building.
With the firm then known as Tolliver and Clarkson?
Tolliver and Clarkson. And they had been partners together under that name since the 1920s.
And fairly quickly after the 1946 arrival of Joe Grier, it became Tolliver, Clarkson, and Grier, did it not?
Yeah. It was a fortunate time for a young lawyer to become actively involved in important affairs, because so many people had been away and so many people had come back. The American Legion was a very dominant organization because all the people who had been in the service joined either the American Legion or the VFW. And I in some fashion or other, and partly by accident, I guess, I joined the Legion, and being inclined to move ahead where I had an opportunity to, soon became, along with some other people who had just came back, there was a sort of anti-World War I movement among the World War II people. We took a great pride in doing things on our own and in not allowing them. We had got up a separate new American Legion post called Independence Post. David Henderson, who's now at Charlotte Bar, was really the person who got the crowd together the first time, but then they pretty soon they had an election for commander, and I was the first commander. And if you were setting out to develop a law practice, that was a pretty good client to launch from.
The American Legion post-World War II then was very politically active in what was going on in the state, I guess.
Yes, and there was a Hankins, who was
Happened to be my father.
happened to be your father, who was very much active in it with his partner Whittington.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you became the commander of the American Legion for the whole state, did you not?
Well, I did in probably an interval of a couple of years, during which I was post commander and division commander or something, and then was department commander. And then that too was 1950, 49, 50. The Legion was a very important. There must have been, I think there were 13 Legion posts in Mecklenburg County. It was a great organization.
Now, during those late 40s years, there were some efforts made to exercise political influence among you veterans with respect to the city council and other elected posts, was there not?
Your father's partner, Whittington.
Right, Jim Whittington.
Jim Whittington was one of the people that was elected to the city council in the sort of arrangements that you make some reference to.
And I feel like that your life during those years right after the war was busy with establishing your law practice and becoming very involved in community activities both in Charlotte and the state. Is that fair to say?
That's true, and then and very soon after that, Catherine and I were married in 49, which changed the course of my life very dramatically and very suddenly. I guess before Catherine and I were married, the course I was on, I would have run for Congress or done something political. And instead of that, our son Joe was born in 51, and then followed by five brothers and sisters. And the decade of the 50s was pretty well dedicated to converting from whatever sort of freewheeling fellow I had been to a very confined family person.
The post-war bachelor quickly became a father of a big family. Is that right?
That's got the truth.
Now, as of 1950, then your firm was composed of you, Mr. Tolliver, and Mr. Clarkson. Would that be right?
That's right. And they were, they treated me very well. They gave me a secretary early on. And pretty soon, it was apparent that of the three of us, that we were developing enough practice where we had to begin hiring associates. And we began. Robert Stewart was the first one we did, and he didn't stay in the same progression, but he came, and then Francis, and then Bill Poe, and then we took them a new associate every year. It's all through the 50s.
Now, if I have looked correctly at these numbers, in 1950, your firm was composed of 5 lawyers, and at that time was the second largest firm in Charlotte. Does that sound correct?
That sounds correct. There were not law firms in Charlotte. The practice of law in Charlotte was individuals.
And generally speaking, the lawyers practicing in Charlotte in those days were all, for the most part, general practitioners. Would that be true?
That would be true. There was Mr. Thigpen had a tax practice. Wally Pad had a patent practice. But basically, the lawyers were general practitioners.
So from the time of 1950 up to today, you have seen an incredible change from a standpoint of firm growth and specialization of the practice during your time here at the bar.
That's true. the growth of the bar in numbers and in specialization, as you observe, have been characteristics of it. When all the lawyers were in Charlotte, who were in Charlotte, were in virtually all in one building, each lawyer knew each other lawyer, and when the law building could no longer accommodate all the people, and they began to spread out into other places to have offices. But at the time, the bar was a very congenial, socially active. We had an organized wives organization who had their regular meetings and their regular organizations and all their various social events.
The legal auxiliary.
The legal auxiliary.
During the 50s, you were active in some civic things that included city planning and that sort of thing. And do I have those dates right about that?
The thing that I was most active in early on was the Park and Recreation Commission. I was appointed on that, and in due course became chairman of it. And it had a good deal to do with enlarging Memorial Stadium, in operating the parks, later with integrating the parks. One of the more controversial things that I was involved in was the integration of all of the recreation facilities in Charlotte, including the swimming pools. One of the things that I was involved in that proved, I guess, the principle that if you do things in a planned way and do them before somebody makes you do them, you can do an awful lot more than if you wait until you're forced to do it. We decided the parks in Baltimore in the very early 60s went through litigation about the rights of blacks to use the park facilities there, and there was a federal order ordering the Baltimore parks to integrate before any move started in Charlotte, and we took the lesson from that and voluntarily desegregated all of the parks in Charlotte long before that there was any litigation in the schools or any litigation about doing it. And it turned out that if you did it voluntarily and bided your time, we waited until mid-August of a particular year to let blacks in the swimming pools. And within 2 weeks after that, the pools closed. And we had it staged where the first time that blacks went in, they were all black women. And it turned out that it barely got any publicity because there was never any fuss about it. And the next year, when the thing opened, the integration just was taken as a matter of course, and they never had any fuss here at all about the park facility.
Mr. Grier, in the 1960s, there was at least some expectation in the bar that you might be the appointee for the federal district court judgeship here when Jim McMillan received that appointment. Tell us a little bit about what happened at that time.
It was apparent that there was going to be a opportunity to have a federal judge here. Traditionally, we've always had a federal judge from the west, right, one from the center, and one from the Charlotte area, and one from the east. And whoever had been the federal judge from the middle, sort of the middle of the state, retired or was taking early retirement.
My recollection is that the western judge died, and Judge Johnson, or President Johnson, had an appointment to replace the deceased judge, but I could be wrong about that.
In any event, there were a number of people who who thought that I ought to be the district judge. And somewhat mildly, I thought that probably would be all right, though I was really more interested in practicing law than I was in getting to be the judge. It turned out that Jim McMillan, who he and I had been Chapel Hill, Harvard, good friends, aspired to be, and Jim carried on, began early, visited the senators and went down, met the governor and talked around and let it be known. Later on, some people who largely, I guess, were in our firm decided, and I really thought that most of the time that the people in our firm really hoped I wouldn't do it so I could stay on running the firm. But in any event, Jim was a good deal more active about getting the appointment. And though if I had started in time, Sam Irwin would have been delighted to have appointed me. Actually, if I'd gone up there and asked him to at the right time, he would have done it because he and I had other things together, but I didn't. And it got down in some fashion to taking a sort of a head count vote among the members, practicing members of the bar as to who the bar would endorse. Later, Ben Horak, who was president of the bar at the time, told me that if you'd just asked us to, we would have nominated you and not had a plebiscite about it, but I didn't. And they did take a vote, and Jim was the preference. I forgot, it's fairly close, but was a preference.
And as a result of that appointment of Jim McMillan, he was eventually the one who heard the Swan case, became one of the more well-known district court judges in all of the United States during that period of time.
That's right, and made an outstanding judge. If you agreed with, and no one really would have expected when he took the place that he would be take some of the positions that he did take. He was a good deal more liberal and more radical, if you could use that word, than would have been expected with the background coming out of Helms and Mullis and Eastern North Carolina and Scotch-Irish Presbyterian that he was. McMillan was in his judgeship was in effect putting into effect the principles of his life, and you can't have do anything but admire the strength of the convictions that he had, which he persisted in at the risk of his own life. It was so controversial when he began to do some of the things that he was doing.
You and Judge McMillan remain close colleagues and friends through to the end of his life.
End of his life. One of the things that, and this may not belong in the record that we're making now, toward the end of his life, he told me that Margie, as he put it, gave him hell because she told him, you know, that place belongs to Joe.
Now, through a great deal of your time in the practice, you have been general counsel to the Charlotte Coliseum Authority. Is that correct?
That's true.
That's been an interesting and enjoyable area of practice for you, I would think.
Being a little taken by surprise to try to think about it, I can't really imagine. I have never been a member of the authority, but I've always been the attorney, which I guess is even better. Back in 1951, some people who at that time were extremely active in the Chamber of Commerce, and this was pretty quickly after World War II, realized that Charlotte did not have a auditorium or did not have a coliseum. And they caused city government to create this auditorium coliseum authority and saw to it that land was purchased out on Independence Boulevard, which at that time was thought to be nearer Monroe than Charlotte, so far out of Charlotte's business section of Charlotte it was. And in some fashion, and I can't remember exactly how that came about, but the people who were on the authority chose Paul Buck to be the active director of the authority, the full-time professional of it. And for some reason that, again, I can't prescribe exactly the reason for, Buck employed me as the attorney for the authority. And it turned out that pretty soon they added the Civic Center, and then they built the Charlotte Coliseum out on Coliseum Road, and then they built building the arena, and all the time the representation of that authority has been an active client for whatever firm I was associated with, and a very good practice and a very important practice for the life of the city.
Now, Queens College has played a big part in your life. You've been on its board of trustees for years and served as its chairman for a good number of years, and I think there are probably people in town who would credit you with having saved Queens College in the 1970s.
How I became associated with it is related to the fact that my uncle, Mr. C.P. Street, was chairman of the board of Queens College, and some way or other, and I don't know whether he just engaged me as the college's attorney or whether he had me elected a trustee. I expect he probably had me elected a trustee so that I wouldn't have to be paid. Anyway, early on, I did become a trustee of Queens. Like a number of situations, the means by which you become the dominant figure in it turns out to be sort of a freak. He and Jimmy Harris, James J. Harris and C.P. Street, were the two principal trustees of Queens College at the time. And there came a time when they announced, they took me aside and said, we're going to, this time of year, it was probably about November, we said we customarily go to Florida every year at this time, and while we are going to Florida now, would you look after things at the college for the trustees while we're gone? And of course there's no answer I could do, but if that's what you want me to do, I'll try to do. We went off to Florida and stayed until well into the next year, and they came back and they took me aside and they said, things have gone so well while we weren't here and you were doing them, why don't you just keep on doing them? And I've not been able to disassociate myself, and I've not tried to, from the association with Queens, but that's the origin of it.
Mr. Grier, over your 60 plus years of practice, you've had many friends and colleagues in the practice of law. Tell us about some of those folks that you have known at the bar that have been particularly memorable for you in your life as a lawyer.
Well, you'd have to start with the law firm. Francis I guess, was the first person that we added to the law firm after Mr. Clarkson and Mr. Tolliver. Judge Clarkson, Mr. Clarkson, was soon appointed judge and dropped out, and Mr. Tolliver soon became ill and dropped out. And it was then pretty soon, it was, I was left, and it is, as you made reference to, it was Tolliver, Clarkson, and Grier, but pretty soon both Tolliver and Clarkson dropped out. And by that time, other people had come. Francis, I guess, was the first, and then Bill Poe, and then Sid Thompson, and then Herbert Brown, and then Mark Bernstein, and the rest of the line. And fortunately, almost all of you are still there.
That's right.
You're lost almost no people. And how many people do you now have in the firm?
We have about 160 in the firm now.
160 in the firm, starting from zero in 50 years. Yeah, that's good growth. And it's always been a firm of great reputation.
Well, you gave us great guidance in how to get things started off on the right foot.
Well, we spent a lot of time, and more than Joe and I now spend on this firm. We used to meet when there were only 3 or 4 of us, 4 or 5, until the house got too small. We used to meet when I lived on Sterling Road. We'd meet one night a week out at my house, and would meet 2 or 3 hours and talk about all the business that we were doing. And continued that until it got where we had so many people that we couldn't meet there anymore. And we began to meet over on a place that I can't now identify. It was the YMCA building. Yeah, you would
Breakfast at the YMCA.
We started, instead of meeting at night, started meeting at breakfast. And a number of people have told me they think that that's one of the best things that the firm did when it was of a size in which it can continue to do that, to have these regular breakfast meetings at which the affairs of the firm were put on the table, and meetings would last a couple hours.
So the firm continued to grow from your early days all the way through the time in 1984 when you left the firm to join practice with your son. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. At which time I was really at retirement age for the firm. I was 68, I guess, maybe at the time.
And since 1984, you have continued to be in active practice with your son in his firm and your firm that has grown again. So you've been through that process to develop a second firm, I believe.
Yeah. Well, and we have good, there are 7 lawyers now in the firm, and they are of the same quality that you have had and have maintained in Grier, Parker, Poe.
Tell us about some of the things that you would consider to be the most memorable events along the way in your time of practice, cases or transactions or things that you have handled that you particularly would remember as high points along the way.
Well, I think the most significant case that I've been involved in, I guess, would be the litigation that involved the constitutionality of the North Carolina statutes providing scholarship and loans to students at the 38 private colleges and universities in North Carolina. Some way I had come to represent the Association of Independent Colleges, and pretty soon after the appropriations of the General Assembly began to be fairly substantial in terms of the amount of money that was appropriated for those programs, the association, and I'm trying to think of the well-known name of it, who brought suit to challenge the constitutionality of it because of all of the 38 colleges were related in some fashion to a religious denomination, Belmont Abbey and Pfeiffer. What's the institution that's the national organization that's always challenging the separation of church and state?
It's American Civil Liberties Union?
American Civil Liberties Union brought suit challenging the constitutionality, and the private colleges engaged me to represent them in defense of that litigation. And we did. One of Reichert's stories about my performance as a litigator is about my speech to the three-judge district court. He loves to tell that when he gets a proper audience around.
Well, I think Reichert considers that, we're talking about William Reichert, who practices with me today, talks about that as one of his great training vehicles by which he learned to be a real litigator, watching you in that case. Now, who was the three-judge panel that heard that case?
Brack Craven, Woodrow Jones, and Jim McMillan. Yeah.
And they decided for you, is that right?
Well, they did. Though the case had a sort of a unique twist at the end that probably is more interesting than was the legal argument at the time. We had a three-judge court, and I made the principal argument, and there was an argument on the other side, and the judges took the case under advisement, and we had become so persuaded by the quality of our argument that we felt pretty confident about it. But before the court could decide, Brack Craven dropped dead. And he was the presiding judge at the three-judge court, and the general assumption was that he had been assigned the judge, he was going to write the opinion. And what happened about it, and this has pretty well escaped any notoriety, is that Clement Hainsworth, who was then the chief judge of the Fourth Circuit, who had never been involved in the case at all, had never attended a hearing, had no part in it at all, sent word to the clerk of the court to send him the documents in the case. He took the documents and within about 2 weeks drafted an opinion upholding the constitutionality of the acts and issued it per curiam. And nobody ever challenged it. And he had absolutely nothing to do with the case up to that point. Had never been in a single hearing. Did it on his own. The lawyers, we were amazed. We didn't know when Craven dropped dead, we said, uh-oh, we thought we had done a good job persuading him. And now we're going to have to start all the way over again. And next thing we knew, we get a copy of Craven, of Hainsworth's order affirming the whole thing, and it so took the other people by surprise that I'm not sure about this, but I don't think they ever protested it.
And to this day, that decision remains in place, and the state continues to provide those support funds for students in private colleges.
Well, they do, and of course the legislature has come to regard those appropriations as routine. And without it getting involved apparently in politics anymore, those awards are made, and of course they've been millions of dollars over the number of years that they've been.
You have seen a lot of changes in our profession. What would you think, what would you call the biggest changes that you have seen during your 60 years?
Well, I would guess the most significant would be the nature of the practice. Where before, in the early days of the practice, it related primarily to people's personal affairs, their individual affairs, and their personal controversies. So that the nature of the practice is I think, has changed in the direction of of being, and I think the business of the efforts to re-emphasize professionalism is evidence of the apprehension that the practice of law was getting to be more akin to the practice of accounting and of things that did not relate to the original practice of law as it had originated in England. I think the need for the professionalism that the three of us here are involved in comes out of the change in the way, in the substance of law practice and in the emphasis that's been put on the business aspect of it. I don't know whether you remember, but billing by the hour was a thing that makes it more like an accountant does than the lawyer traditionally did, where theoretically in the model on the English practice, somebody would intervene for you and set your fee for you after you had done the work. You did the work, and then some negotiator, as I understand the English arrangement, is then negotiates what the fee is going to be. And the law here fell into the business of keeping time records, and though the Bar Association rules speak of the same considerations now of difficulty of the job and the effectiveness of it, and the same rules have not changed at all. It has gotten, and I guess continues to get more and more, a business of accounting for time gets to be more important, and I think that the emphasis that the three of us have some major interest in putting the emphasis back on professionalism has to trump over the notion of simply keeping time and sending the client a bill for however many hours you put in, whether you did him any good or not, or whether it was terribly hard or not. It gets to be mighty easy to, when you come to bill the client, to get out your timesheet and say, I've spent 43 hours on this, and I've spent almost all my time working on it, and base your fee on that, which is contrary to the basic notions of professionalism.
Do you think the lawyers today see themselves differently as their place in society than was the case 60 years ago?
Well, I think the nature of the practice has changed, where it is so much more representation of people in business transactions, where when I first began to practice, a great deal of it had to do with personal relationships, with divorce and matrimonial business and things of that sort that virtually disappeared from the practice now. Nobody in this firm has any idea about doing any things of that sort now. Well, I think that has changed.
What would be your guidance for the lawyers of today in terms of how we can improve upon our life as lawyers and improve the profession?
The training of lawyers at law school is, I'm satisfied, is a good deal better now than it has ever been. So that I think people are coming out of law school with more ideas about what's expected of them technically as lawyers and ethically as lawyers than they did. When I went to law school, there was not any instruction at all with respect to legal ethics. No class was given with respect to legal ethics in Harvard Law School in the years in which I was there. You got out and you started doing whatever you thought, whatever precedents there were around, and whoever you came in with. I think the difficulty that I see the bar having is that so much of the practice relates to business, is helping the various business owners perform their business functions, as distinct from helping them solve their personal lifestyle problem. I think that's a change, and it's simply the number of people practicing law is much larger now because of the changes that have occurred in the nature of the practice than would have been possible had the practice of law been kept in the confines of where it was maybe at the time that I started practicing law. But it's a great way to do a life. The people in the bar that I've known have, to a marked degree, been active in civic affairs, have been good stewards in their church leaders. A great many of them are people that are involved in the bar. And I think the members of the bar have not, in any sense, lost their position of respect that they are entitled to, and that I guess, despite criticisms about them, have always existed.
Mr. Grier, we thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today to give us your insights and views over these years in the practice, and I hope we have another opportunity to do this again.
Well, I thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate in this. I enjoyed tremendously being in Raleigh at the presentation of the award, and I shall always treat that as one of the highest honors that I've ever received. And Hank, I thank you for your participation in this, and have great memories of the years in which you were in and I were in daily practice, and I'm tremendously proud of the way what used to be Grier Parker Poe has carried on in the highest traditions of the profession.